You ready, David?
Oh, yeah.
Good morning. We had to wait on the hammer. Good morning. This hearing of the Subcommittee on Commodity Exchanges, Energy and Credit regarding the reauthorization of the CFTC as it relates to perspectives of the Commissioners will come to order. Good morning. Thank you for joining us for this hearing of the Commodity Exchanges, Energy and Credit Subcommittee as we continue the Agriculture Committee's work towards CFTC reauthorization. Thus far, we've appreciated the opportunity to hear perspectives on reauthorization from end users and market participants. Their testimony has been vital to helping us gain a better and more complete understanding of ways in which our regulatory structure could better serve the markets that it is designed to regulate. Today, we will continue our examination of the reauthorization of the CFTC with the important step of hearing from the Commission itself. I'm glad to welcome Commissioner Mark Weegan, Commissioner Sharon Bowen, and Commissioner Chris Giancarlo to the committee. This marks the first appearance before members of this committee for Commissioner Bowen, so we extend a warm welcome to her. And we thank each of you for taking time to appear before us today and share your perspectives on the Commission, what works, and perhaps what doesn't work. Guided by our principles that regulatory requirements be both minimized and justified, and that regulations provide clarity and certainty, we hope this reauthorization process will illuminate areas in which we can help the Commission function more efficiently. Collectively, the Commissioners represent a wide breadth and depth of experience and insight, and we appreciate their willingness to use their talents in service to the public. Accordingly, one of our goals in this committee is to ensure that each Commissioner at the CFTC is adequately empowered within his or her role. It's been noted many times before this committee, but always bears repeating, that derivatives markets are essential not only to the farmers, ranchers, and end users who utilize them, but to our broader economy. We'll continue to look for a healthy balance between market access and market integrity so that the markets meet the needs of those who use them to hedge. Thank you again to our witnesses for joining us here today, and thank you for the important work that you do at the Commission. You serve our nation well, and we appreciate your choice to do so. With that, I'll turn to Ranking Member Scott.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and to our distinguished Commissioners, welcome. As a Democratic Ranking Member, I want to emphasize how pleased I am with the work that we have been able to accomplish so far as we examine the critical issues that affect our markets and our ability to continue in a very good bipartisan process of reauthorizing the Commodities Exchange Act, commonly referred to as the CEA. So far, we've had several robust committee hearings in which we've examined the concerns of both our market participants and we've heard the concerns of our end users. So, Mr. Chairman, I'm pleased with the level of discussion and knowledge that we have had so far in our hearings, and I'm delighted today that we will hear from those who handle the infrastructure, those who have to deal with making sure we have a level playing field for both our end users and our market participants, and protect the best interests of the American people and our fine, outstanding financial system. Commissioner Weegan, Commissioner Bowen, and Commissioner Giancarlo, I want to thank you for being here today. You have great perspective. We value your input. We value your views, and we know that you will provide a critical foundation for the work that this committee must undertake in the reauthorization of the Commodities Exchange Act. But not only that, we really respect your involvement and understanding of the deep complexity of this entire issue as we move forward. For it is both your charge and this committee's charge to have the jurisdiction of the complete Section 7 of Dodd-Frank. So, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to again commend the committee's previous work, where we worked last year on 1413, which will provide the basis for what we do today. And I'm looking forward to hearing from our distinguished panel regarding their thoughts on that particular bill as a framework for us going forward, but also on some very critical issues like the EU recognition of U.S. clearinghouses and vice versa, the recognition of U.S. recognition of foreign clearinghouses, the U.S. definition of U.S. person, position limits, cross-border, so many issues that are ratcheting up for us. And as we all know, I have mentioned in every hearing regarding the CEE reauthorization, the importance of providing the CFTC with the adequate level of funding that we need, because all of what we deal with, all of what I've just said, means almost virtually nothing if you do not have the funds with which to do the job. And I've continually stressed, as we have evolved in this issue of derivatives and swaps, I mean, the mission, the clarity and purpose of the CFTC and your workload has increased 300–400%. So I am anxious to hear from each of you that fact that you do have enough funding, you need more funding. Only you are in the best position to tell us the answers to those critical questions on funding. So finally, let us not forget what the CFTC's primary mission is. It is to foster open, transparent, competitive, and financially sound markets and avoid systemic risks and protect the market users and their funds, consumers, and the public from fraud or manipulation. What a task, what an opportunity. We're looking forward to hearing from you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Scott. And I see that the full committee chairman has joined us, Mr. Conaway from Texas. I'd like to recognize you if you have any opening statement.
Well, I don't, Austin, other than to say thank you and David for holding the hearing, and also thank you to our witnesses. You're going to be an integral and important part of the reauthorization process, and so your comments today we'll be taken very seriously as we move forward on the full reauthorization. So look forward to hearing, and you're back.
Thank you. The chair would request that other members submit their opening statements for the record so that witnesses may begin their testimony and to ensure that there is ample time for questions. The chair would also like to remind members that they will be recognized for questioning in order of seniority for members who were present at the start of the hearing. After that, members will be recognized in order of their arrival. Appreciate your understanding. Witnesses are also reminded to limit their oral presentation to 5 minutes. All written statements will be included in the record. I'd like to welcome our witnesses to the table, the Honorable Sharon Bowen, Commissioner, Commodity Futures Trading Commission, Washington, D.C., the Honorable Chris Giancarlo, Commissioner, Commodities Futures Trading Commission, Washington, D.C., and the Honorable Mark Weechin, Commissioner, Commodities Futures Trading Commission, Washington, D.C. Commissioner Bowen, please begin when you are ready.
Trading Commission, on which I serve as a commissioner. It is an honor and a privilege to appear before you today. First, I'd like to express my gratitude to our extremely hardworking staff. If members of this subcommittee leave this hearing with only 2 new pieces of information today, I hope that it is first, our staff truly are the hardest working, most professional staff in a government agency. Second, that while our staff can accomplish a great deal with limited resources, the agency desperately needs additional funding and staff to carry out our mission of regulating and protecting the swaps and futures markets. If there was some way in this reauthorization to allow the CFTC to set fees on registrants or a de minimis fee on some trades, as the SEC is empowered to do so, that would be extremely helpful. I'd like to extend my appreciation and thanks to my 2 fellow commissioners, Mark Weechin and Chris Giancarlo, testifying with me today. I am fortunate to serve with them and Chairman Massett. I want to extend my gratitude to our chairman for addressing a number of concerns of end users and other stakeholders. While some of us may disagree about the state of systemic risk to the swaps and futures market or the wisdom of a particular Dodd-Frank requirement, I hope we can all agree on this. The Commodity Futures Trading Commission should be reauthorized. Its role in overseeing the derivatives market is critical to protecting global financial stability and the U.S. economy, and thus assuring the American people that their voices and interests are heard. To that end, I would like to offer a few recommendations to you as you begin this effort to reauthorize this agency. The first, of course, is self-funding, which I mentioned previously. The CFTC was last reauthorized by Congress in August 2008, and it's, as we all know only too well, the world has changed greatly since then. Second, I believe it is time to reevaluate how our system of self-regulatory organizations is functioning. It would be wise to take a comprehensive look at this system and to ensure that it's set up to work efficiently, cohesively, and effectively. If a part of it isn't working, or if there's an area of regulation that needs to be addressed, I hope we will do that. In particular, I believe it's prudent to establish a separate SRO just for swaps and market participants. In his recent white paper, Commissioner Giancarlo proposed an established system of professional standards for the swaps market. I think that is a good proposal. And a new SRO for the swaps market will be well positioned to implement this. Establishing standards of eligibility and accountability will enhance and strengthen investor protections. Third, I believe it would be wise for us to have stricter regulations on the retail foreign exchange swaps industry. As I have previously said, it is ironic that following the enactment of Dodd-Frank, the retail foreign exchange industry is the least regulated part of the derivatives market. I continue to hold this view. In fact, I believe we should make retail foreign exchange swaps, which directly involve retail investors, at least as regulated as the rest of the swap markets. I also continue to believe that the Commission can and should take action on this subject. Fourth, I believe we should issue new regulations on cybersecurity, though I hope the Commission acts on this on our own very soon. As I recently said in a speech before many operational risk professionals, the fact that trading is now effectively entirely electronic brings with it the risk of cyber attack. As a result, financial actors have become storehouses of massive amounts of data, much of it incredibly sensitive. We have to have protections in place, not only against thieves trying to steal data, but also entities that may be trying to hack into our system just to try and disrupt our financial markets and damage our economy. Finally, we should increase our enforcement penalties. Put simply, some of our current enforcement penalties really require updating. They should not convey the message that it's just the cost of doing business to pay these penalties. I would support updating these enforcement penalties so they are tough, fair, and fit the scope and scale of the markets we regulate. All financial markets are the lifeblood of our economy. They allow capital to be more efficiently invested and help to allow newer, leaner, and more innovative enterprises and investors to thrive. But without fair, rigorous rules in place, the system breaks down, harming investors, businesses, and our overall economy. The CFTC has changed greatly in the last few years, and it is in the best interest of the industry, investors, and the public that the Commission's authorizing legislation is up to date, so that the CFTC can meet today's challenges and those that are likely to unfold in the future. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Commissioner Giancarlo.
Good morning. Good morning, Chairman Scott, Ranking Member Scott, and Chairman Conaway. Thank you for the very kind introduction, and thank you for the opportunity to testify. I want to first thank the CFTC staff for their hard work and dedication, and I also thank my fellow commissioners. It is a privilege to work with such fine colleagues in service to the American people. This is my first appearance before you as a commissioner, Let me briefly say that I have been a consistent advocate for the 3 pillars of Title VII of Dodd-Frank: enhanced swaps transparency, regulated swaps execution, and increased central counterparty clearing. My support for these reforms is based on over a dozen years as an operator of global marketplaces for swaps trading. I believe that balanced and well-crafted regulatory oversight should go hand in hand with vibrant, transparent, and competitive markets essential to American prosperity. As you know, the passage of the Dodd-Frank Act was made possible by the promise to exempt commercial end users. Yet over the past few years, end users have been caught up in the CFTC's rule writing. As I elaborate in my written testimony, there are several important provisions that the committee can include in reauthorization to provide relief to the farmers, ranchers, energy companies, utilities, and manufacturers who rely on our derivative markets. I'm pleased that last fall the Commission provided relief to non-for-profit taxpayer-owned utilities to manage risks in the production of electricity and natural gas. We also provided relief with respect to when residual interest was calculated so as not to overly burden the customers of future commission merchants who use futures to manage their everyday business risk. Yet we must do more. My fellow commissioners and I are at work on changing burdensome record-keeping requirements under our Rule 1.35 and improving our guidance on when forwards with embedded volumetric optionality are excluded from treatment as swaps. And I'm hopeful that we can all agree that trade options should not be subject to position limits. We've not yet resolved all of these end-user issues, but what is notable is that we are working together as a commission to achieve a better outcome. Still, CFTC rules on position limits remain a work in progress. They were meant to curb excessive speculation that was arguably present in the market when the Dodd-Frank Act was written. Yet market conditions today have dramatically changed, especially in U.S. energy markets, where excessive speculation appears to show no presence at all in the decline in energy prices. Unfortunately, the CFTC's rule proposal would impose the most complex and restrictive position limits rule you can imagine. It would reject the successful experience of U.S. futures exchanges in managing position accountability levels. Instead, it would impose one-size-fits-all hard limits with sharply reduced and narrowed exceptions for bona fide hedging. It would substitute Washington regulatory dictates for the commercial judgment of America's farmers, ranchers, and manufacturers when it comes to everyday business risk management. We must be sure that in curbing excessive speculation, we do not place costly burdens on hedgers, end users, and American consumers, the very ones that Congress intended to protect in the first place. Earlier this year, I published a white paper analyzing the CFTC swaps trading rules. I believe that Congress got it right with a straightforward and flexible legislative framework well-suited to inherent market dynamics. Unfortunately, the CFTC's rules did not follow Congress's simple outline. These rules have produced enormous regulatory complexity without meaningful market benefit, wasting taxpayer money at a time when the agency is seeking additional funding. Instead, I've proposed a pro-reform swaps trading regulatory framework built upon 5 key tenets: comprehensiveness, cohesiveness, flexibility, professionalism, and transparency. The 2009 Pittsburgh Accords called for global financial reform through coordinated regulatory action. Yet for some time, unsatisfactory relations between the CFTC and its overseas counterparty regulators threatened a modern-day trade war in financial services. Regulators on both sides of the Atlantic continue to erect separate, complex regulatory protocols that struggle to interact with each other. And meanwhile, Asian authorities take a wait-and-see approach. The result is fragmentation of global financial service markets into distinct national and continental sectors. This will slow worldwide economic growth. This will not reduce systemic risk, but increase it. I'm pleased to note, however, that Chairman Massett and CFTC staff, especially the Division of Clearing and Risk, are working constructively with our international counterparts. The CFTC has accomplished much since the passage of the Dodd-Frank Act, yet it must do more to reduce regulatory burdens on end users. It must also match its oversight of U.S. exchange-traded derivatives with excellence in regulating swaps markets, while addressing growing global market fragmentation. I look forward to working with this committee and with my CFTC colleagues to complete these important tasks. Thank you.
Commissioner Weegan.
Good morning, Chairman Scott, Ranking Member Scott, Chairman Conaway, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for inviting me to testify before you today and allowing me to share some of my thoughts on the reauthorization of the Commodity Futures Trading Commission. It is a pleasure to be here. I would like to acknowledge my colleagues and friends sitting beside me, Commissioner Bowen and Commissioner Giancarlo. Both have spent much of their careers working in the financial markets in some capacity, and so have brought significant expertise and professionalism to the Commission, which benefits not only the Commission's work, but the public as well. It is an honor to serve with them. I also want to acknowledge Chairman Massad for his continued pursuit of an agenda dedicated to further implementation of and refinements to Dodd-Frank. He has led the Commission in an admirable way and has achieved consensus through his engagement in the Commission's policymaking and enforcement missions. I also appreciate this subcommittee's constructive and collaborative relationship with the Commission. The swaps and futures markets in the U.S. look considerably different today than they did in 2011 when I joined the Commission. Today, there are more than 100 swap dealers provisionally registered with the CFTC, clearing mandates in place for liquid swaps, and trading mandates requiring liquid swaps to be executed on registered exchanges or CEFs. There also are new reporting obligations for market participants. Additionally, registered clearinghouses must meet heightened risk management requirements, and customer funds held by clearing members enjoy greater protections. The sum of these component rules and requirements is a safer and more transparent market structure for derivatives in the U.S. But there remains more work to be done, including 3 key rulemakings to implement Dodd-Frank. The rulemaking on margin requirements for uncleared swaps, the rulemaking on capital requirements related to uncleared swaps, and the rulemaking on federal position limits. My written testimony goes into detail about a variety of other initiatives the Commission should undertake to continue and improve its implementation efforts. It also identifies developing trends in the derivatives markets that this committee should monitor in its oversight capacity. I will briefly summarize some of the key points. Regarding cross-border initiatives, the Commission should clarify how it views the use of U.S. personnel by registered dealers otherwise located outside the U.S., and should use its authority to create a foreign CEF regime. These steps would address challenges created by the Commission's first mover impact as it has implemented reforms, especially the swap trading mandate. The Commission also should take steps to promote the trading of swaps on CEFs. These steps should include revising the conditions for eligibility under the floor trader exemption, clarifying that anonymous trading protocols on CEFs must remain anonymous post-execution, clarifying the application of the embargo rule as it relates to workup trading sessions on CEFs, and revising the process for imposing a trading mandate for swaps. Importantly, the Commission also must promptly approve CEF requests to offer appropriate execution methods different from those expressly permitted in the CEF rule. Regarding FCM risk management, the Commission should clarify how FCMs may screen block trades that are executed on or pursuant to the rules of CEFs. All of these steps the Commission could undertake with existing authority. If accomplished, these steps would lead to an even safer and simplified market structure. The Congress could assist the Commission in 2 important ways through the reauthorization process. First, although outside the specific jurisdiction of this subcommittee, the Congress should consider amendments to the Bankruptcy Code to allow the protection of individually segregated margin accounts of customers. This would enhance both customer protections and choice that would benefit end users. Second, the Congress should revise the indemnification provision related to the use of data kept at swap data repositories. The current law has impeded data sharing and harmonization efforts at both the domestic and international levels. Finally, there are several developing trends this subcommittee should monitor because it could provoke future policymaking responses. In no particular order, they are regulatory market fragmentation, public distributed ledger technologies, FCM concentration, clearinghouse risk controls, automated trading systems, and cybersecurity. I'm happy to elaborate further on these topics. Thank you again for inviting me, and I look forward to questions.
Thank you, Commissioners. And I'd like to remind the members, we'd like to hold as closely as possible to the 5-minute rule, and then hopefully we'll have a second round of questions. I'd like to start with a question about the swap dealer de minimis levels that I'm sure you're familiar with. We've heard numerous witnesses explain the uncertainty that they face with the current rule that automatically lowers the swap dealer de minimis level, regardless of the results of the pending study on what the level should be. Recently, the Commission voted to undo a similar automatic change in the residual interest deadline. I'd like to ask each of you, do you think it would be appropriate to also undo the automatic change in the swap dealer de minimis level and simply set it at $8 billion unless the Commission votes to change that? It's for all of you.
Are we going in alphabetical order, Sharon?
We'll go Commissioner Bellwin.
Yes, hi. I think it's important that we make sure that our rules are based upon good data. And at this stage, I have no basis upon which I would suggest that we change a rule that's already in effect. So at this stage, I would not think that would be wise for us to do so.
Chairman, under the prior chairman of the CFTC, 2 rules were adopted. You referred to both of them, residual interest and the swap dealer de minimis. Both of those called for an automatic change in the standard in the year 2017, and both of those rules called for a study to be done. And in both cases, they prescribed that whatever the outcome of the study, the rule would nevertheless change. I disagree with that just as a matter of good regulatory practice. If we're going to go and spend the taxpayers' money to do a study, then we ought to take account of what the study says before we change our rule. That was the basis for which we, in September, changed the rule with regard to residual interest. What we said was we will read that study, and then if residual interest needs to be a change, we will make the change. At the same time, I also said I think we should approach it in the same way with regard to the de minimis levels for swap dealers. Right now, $8 billion and more is the qualification by which an entity is treated as a swap dealer. In 2017, that will automatically lower to a $3 billion threshold, regardless of what the study that we're spending taxpayer money to do says should be the right level. So I feel that we should not make an automatic change. We should read the study, and then if it's appropriate to change the de minimis level, we should do that.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Chairman, I echo the comments made by my fellow commissioners. I think the importance here is that whatever decision is made about what types of entities should be registered as dealers, there should be a data-based reason for it. I actually think the way the rule is drafted now reflects that approach, but I'm open to changing that approach as well. If a vote has to take place after a data analysis is done, I'm perfectly comfortable with that. As Commissioner Giancarlo alluded to, we just made a similar revision, as you alluded to, we made a similar revision in the residual interest context, so I'm open to it in the swap dealer de minimis context as well.
Thank you. Last fall, there was an article on risk.net regarding the use of special calls by the CFTC staff. The article noted that many firms who are small, legitimate hedgers are facing increased scrutiny under the large trader reporting rule. This rule significantly lowered the amount of exposure in swaps contracts that would trigger a reporting requirement, in some cases to as little as 1/4 of the equivalent exposure in the comparable futures contract. Commissioner Giancarlo, can you explain the process for deciding when special calls are issued and what the internal process for overseeing them is, and have they ever been issued in error?
Thank you, Chairman. The special call process is a process used at the CFTC as part of its oversight authority and as part of its longstanding practice at the Commission. Special calls have a role in a legitimate role in our work. I am aware, have become aware over the last few months of a large number of industry participants raising concerns about an expansion in the use of special calls, a fairly dramatic expansion over the last several years. I'm also aware that these special call letters contain in them some fairly serious statements about legal liability and responsiveness, some of which are market participants perceive to be fairly threatening. It's also come to my attention that in sometime in the fall, several hundred special call letters were issued that had to be called back in the first quarter of this year, that they were issued in error. I'm quite concerned that we have the right processes and procedures around our special call process, that there's appropriate oversight within the agency, and there's reporting up through the Commission as to how special calls are used. They do have a legitimate role, but we need to make sure that we as a Commission operate them, because it goes to our credibility as a Commission that we operate this process through proper procedures.
All right, thank you. My time has expired. Mr. Scott.
Thank you, Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me start off by asking each of you, do you believe that we in the Congress are appropriating sufficient funds for you all to do the job that we are declaring you to do?
As I mentioned in my statement, I think it's critically important that we receive additional funds. Our role has expanded tremendously, and yet we have fewer employees today than we did before Dodd-Frank. The markets that we're overseeing are quite complex, and the products that are there are really quite complex. So in order for us to really do our jobs as effective regulators, we really need to be able to have the resources to actually hire additional staff, to make sure that our technology, frankly, is up to date. The market, as you know, moves at extremely fast pace, and that's not likely to change. Likewise, as I mentioned, with cybersecurity being a growing threat, we need to make sure we have the resources to have protections in place.
Thank you. Mr. Giancarlo.
Thank you, Ranking Member. As a longstanding, consistent supporter of the Dodd-Frank reforms, I believe we absolutely must have the resources to do a job that has been greatly expanded. However, I'm also sensitive to the fact that our budget has increased 123% since 2008. I support the current funding levels, and in question of going above those levels really turns on whether, I think as you put it, the job we need to do. And I have some questions as to whether in some cases we're doing the job we need to do, or we're doing other jobs. I have in my white paper outlined ways in which I think our swaps transaction reforms are overly complex, do not accord with the Dodd-Frank reforms. I'm also concerned that our position limits proposal creates an enormous amount of make work for the Commission that could be done in other ways at less taxpayer expense. So finding the right level of funding really is the key question.
Mr. Richard.
Ranking Member, I do think we could use additional resources. The responsibilities of the agency have grown in three different respects. The size of the market we oversee is larger than it was before. The number of registered entities that we regulate has increased, and the amount of risk that registered entities have to manage has also meaningfully increased over the years. So I think to reflect all of those key points, the resources of the agency have to come in line with that as well. This isn't a scientific process. There's no, I don't think there's any special number, but I think, as I just explained, as the responsibilities have grown, the resources of the agency have to grow as well. One last point on the number of registered entities. We have literally tens of thousands of registered entities. We have some help from the NFA in overseeing those entities. The most important entities are clearinghouses, in my judgment, to make sure that those are properly managed, given the amount of risk being managed by those entities at the moment. And we're just not doing a good enough job, I don't believe, in examining them. There are several very important and large clearinghouses that we should be looking at and examining on an annual basis, and given the team we have today, we're not able to do that.
All right. Well, thank you very much. That's been very helpful. Let me go back to you, Ms. Bowen. And you mentioned two important areas that concern to me, cybersecurity, as well as the penalty enforcement level of wrongdoers. Could you elaborate for a moment on that? How do we get our hands around getting stronger enforcement penalties applicable for those within the financial service industry that do wrong, and are there some bad actors out there? What would be your proposal, and how far could you go in terms of bringing criminal actions where people could, if they do wrong, could serve time in jail? Because unless we get to that and be able to nip it in the bud, bring strong, and give examples, we have MF Global, we have so many examples, how would you guide us in that direction?
Thank you for that question. First, I think we should have much higher penalties. I think, frankly, they're just way too low. And we've heard people refer to that as it's just a cost of doing business. So we're not conveying the right message to deter people. The other thing that I would suggest is that because the market that we oversee is so complex with so many bad actors, we need more people. We're the cop on the beat. So we can't afford not to have the sufficient staffing there in terms of our enforcement division. They've done a really great job. We've gotten some fairly large civil penalties over the last few years. And I think in some respects that signals the commitment and the dedication of our enforcement staff. But we need more of them to do the right thing and to make sure that our markets are safe. I mean, frankly, in the 10 months I've been there, I've been frankly surprised at the number of Ponzi schemes and the attempts to take advantage of retirees. And we need to make sure that the most vulnerable are really protected.
Thank you very much. Are you back, Mr. Chairman?
Chairman Conaway, you have 5 minutes or as much time as you would like.
I'll endeavor to stick under the 5-minute rule. Thank you. A couple of years ago, we had European Commissioner named Richard Pearson, should be Patrick Pearson, was in front of us, who was warning us about a regulatory, if we didn't have regulatory harmonization, that firms would conduct and clear their trades in walled off regulatory jurisdictions, which would regionalize markets and concentrate risks in different segments of the world. 2 years hence, are we seeing, two questions, are we seeing Mr. Pearson's predictions come true, and then if so, what are the consequences? So why don't we start on the other end, Mark, come this way this time.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I indicated in my written testimony, Mr. Chairman, that we have seen some regulatory fragmentation since the CFTC has implemented its rules. I believe it's largely the result of this first mover impact I mentioned. There are some changes and revisions that I think we should make, as I've outlined, and I think there's considerable agreement among the commissioners about some initiatives that we can and should take to simplify or refine or improve our rules. But I do think, by and large, what we've seen has been a result of this first mover impact of the CFTC. And part of the reason I say that is our cross-border guidance, it was a risk-based policy making. So we looked at risk and how it might be transferred back to the United States. But importantly, it relies very heavily on this notion of substitute compliance. And in order for it to work, in order to avoid what we've seen happen already, every jurisdiction needs to be open to and embrace a substitute compliance framework. We actually have, at the CFTC, a pretty good record on this, I think. We found substitute compliance for 6 major non-U.S. jurisdictions where we have swap dealers registered. So in essence, we've said, you must register because of the amount of U.S. business you're doing, but if you comply with your home rules, you're going to be compliant with ours. And that's just one example. There are many other examples of substitute compliance that we've already found as an agency. So going forward, we have to continue to do that, including on the trade execution front. I mentioned in my remarks how we need to put in place a foreign CEF regime. We already have a foreign board of trade regime, and those types of regimes are critical, again, to avoiding what we've seen. I wish we didn't have the situation that we're facing now, but again, I think it's largely due to the fact that we've largely completed our implementation effort today, and the other major swap jurisdictions have not.
Thank you for the question, Chairman Conaway. I think Patrick Pearson's prediction has absolutely come true, and I must say he wasn't the only one to make that prediction 2 years ago. We're definitely seeing the conduct and clearing of trades being siloed into regional marketplaces. And unfortunately, we're seeing trading in a whole range of products flee U.S. shores. We've seen interest rate swaps outside of the dollar pairs move outside of the U.S. shores. We've seen it in certain segments of the credit default swaps market and in other financial markets as well. This is not unprecedented. Just a historical example, the multi-trillion-dollar euro-dollar market that takes place in London and in Asia should be a market that should be an onshore market. But Treasury regs put in place in the 1970s drove that marketplace offshore, and when those regs were lifted in the 1980s, those markets did not come back. We have built as I've said in my white paper, a way more over-engineered and overly complex swaps trading regime that is driving trading offshore. Interestingly, the Singapore authorities and the Hong Kong authorities have not put anything similar in place. They're sitting there hoping those markets will move in their direction and they will benefit from it. And it will not only will lose that access to those markets, or at least direct access, all the jobs that will go with them as well. So I'm very concerned about what Patrick Pearson talked about, and I sadly have to say I think it's coming true.
Okay. Ms. Bourne.
I think it is critically important for us to harmonize as best we can. And I agree with Commissioner Regent that I think part of it is a question of timing and the fact that we were the first movers. But let's look at this in the context of a global market, which is the market we're regulating. We're trying to protect investors and to make sure that the risks that may occur outside of our borders don't flow back. And that means that we have to make sure that our standards are sufficient to protect our investors. At the same time, as you know, I support the Chairman's efforts. I think he's making some great progress with substitute compliance and equivalency, and I think we're moving in the right direction. But I would not suggest that we slow down our efforts by any stretch of the imagination.
Yeah, you're back. Thank you.
Mr. Aguilar.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I had a question regarding SEFs. Commissioner Weejan, you mentioned in your testimony some of the ideas that we could implement, and that the success of the SEFs is determined on the volume at these facilities. Can you expand on that? And I'd love to hear what the other commissioners feel we can do specifically, ideas to encourage increased volume.
Thank you, Congressman. There are two requirements of CEFs laid out in Dodd-Frank. The first is to promote trading on CEFs, and then the other is to promote pre-trade price transparency. So there's a dual mandate as it were. And the CEF platform, or the CEF rule, was designed to try and meet those two objectives. But at the heart of this is a congressional intent, I believe, to make these platforms flexible. And to put that into context, if Congress had wanted us to make them less flexible than they are, they could have said that all swaps be traded on a futures exchange. And that's not what we did. So I agree with the other commissioners that we do have a separate task here with CEFs. They're designed to be more flexible than other exchanges. A couple of things I think would be helpful in terms of promoting trading, but also would have the effect of, I think, promoting pre-trade transparency, is bring additional liquidity providers onto the CEFs. And based on a couple of policies in place today, some of those liquidity providers are unwilling to trade on CEFs. So we should not have the same kinds of regulatory obligations for a trading firm that does not have customers, for example, and that uses automated trading systems to trade. We shouldn't have the same obligations for them as we do a swap dealer. That was the purpose behind the floor trader exemption. The conditions in place to take advantage of that exemption, I think, are too onerous, so they need to be revised. That's really I think one of the key things we have to do. I also mentioned the doing away with the name give up of counterparties to trades when they're trading in a centralized limit order book. That sounds like a bunch of gobbledygook, but a centralized limit order book is supposed to be an all-to-all anonymous trading environment. And the fact that some platforms are revealing the identities of some of the participants post-trade, again, discourages some market participants from wanting to trade there. So again, it speaks to the willingness of people to come on board these platforms and trade, and we need to make an adjustment there, I think, as well, if we want to bring additional liquidity providers.
Thank you for your question, Congressman. In 2014, in fact, for the last 5 years in a row, the United States initial public offering market has led the world in IPOs. In fact, companies from all around the world have flocked to conduct their initial public offering on U.S. stock exchange. In fact, the largest IPO in history took place last September when Alibaba listed its shares. Alibaba, a Chinese company, listed its shares on the New York Stock Exchange. Now, they did that despite the fact that the Hong Kong Exchange wooed them enormously to get them to list their offering there. The reason they listed in the United States is because we have the best rules for listing of initial offerings. Not the most lenient rules, not the most harsh rules, but the best rules. That should be our objective with regard to swaps trading as well. We should have the best regulatory regime in the world with the best protections, but the most clarity and, as Commissioner Weejan said, the most flexibility, the same flexibility that Congress provided for in Title VII. I believe if we could get our SEF rules right, we could lead the world in swaps trading, and that will be good for the United States of America. In my written testimony, I've put forward several proposals where I think Congress can help in the area of our core principles. The core principles that were in Title VII were unfortunately lifted directly from the DCM, or Designated Contract Market, specifications for core principles. With some slight changes, we could get our core principles to work much better than they do. Changes in core principle 4 to monitor trading in underlying markets, core principle 6 of the SEF control of position limits, core principle 8, emergency authority for liquidation, and core principle 13 for financial resources. I don't want to take more time. I direct you to my written testimony for an explanation of those. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'm proud to be a sponsor of the newly formed Market Risk Advisory Committee. And frankly, one of our meetings we had a couple weeks ago, market structure and SEFs was one of the primary topics of that day. We have input from the market, we have input from academics, we have input from other stakeholders. And that's the kind of feedback that we need to make sure that we can make the proper decisions. And we're looking at things such as whether no name give up is a practice. We're looking at things as to whether we should separate the SRO function from SEFs. And so I think we're moving in the right direction, and it's something I can tell you that my committee that I sponsor will be looking at a lot more closely.
Thank you, Commissioner. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Congressman Ralph.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome, Commissioners. Thank you for being here today as we sort through this ongoing subject here. Commissioners, in reference to position limits, as was touched on earlier, an important quote by former Commissioner Dunn. He said, "Position limits are, in my opinion, a sideshow that has unnecessarily diverted human and fiscal resources away from actions to prevent another financial crisis. To be clear, no one has proven that the looming specter of excessive speculation in the futures market, re-regulated, even exists, let alone played any role whatsoever in the financial crisis of 2008. Even so, Congress has tasked CFTC with preventing excessive speculation by imposing position limits. This is the law." So do any of you on this panel share Commissioner Dunn's view? And if not, how can we evaluate the effectiveness of any position limits that would be implemented by the CFTC? Do you share any of those views?
Congressman, thank you for the question. I agree with Commissioner Dunn that it is the law that we impose federal position limits. I think the best legal and statutory analysis of Dodd-Frank leads one to that result.
There's a whole lot of stuff in the previous part of the quote that's pretty important too, though. You know,
okay, if I
nothing has been proven that, again, the specter of excessive speculation even exists, let alone played any role in the crisis of 2008.
Commissioner, here's what I'd say about that. When we proposed the position limits rule in the last instance, we had a presentation made by the Office of the Chief Economist. And I don't remember her precise words, but basically what she represented at the open meeting was that there's an equal number of studies that show that there's a role of speculation in terms of pricing of the market, and then there's an equal number of other studies that come to a different result. So, stating that more simply, I think the studies are a little inconclusive at the moment. But nonetheless, I think that, again, the best statutory construction leads me to believe that we have a mandate as an agency to impose the position limits. That's not to say that we have to impose inflexible position limits that just aren't workable. Congress gave us a number of different ways to make sure we have appropriate bona fide hedging exemptions eligible for the marketplace, for example. So that's my position. We're legally required to do it, but we need to impose a sensible and flexible position limits regime.
Flexibility is key. We don't want to inhibit liquidity in the markets. Commissioner Bowen, I want to touch on the data that is currently being used to design these limits. How current is that data, and would input from the industry be helpful in keeping that current, or make it more up to date? Please, how current is what you're using at this point?
So, the staff has been working quite hard to make sure that the data that we receive is accurate and that it's useful. We have the ability to, do market surveillance on a daily basis, and that's critically important to our ability to make sure that our markets are safe. So I think we've made some great progress in terms of making sure that the data that we receive is relevant.
How about current, though? That was my key point in the question. How current is that data?
Well, we get data, every day we get data. We get reports every day. And so the data is, frankly, quite current.
Okay. And now, does industry have a role in helping you to properly vetted data, but helping you to shape that, the usage of that data as well?
Yes. I mean, it will allow us to look at trends that may be happening in the market. One of the ways and one of the reasons we have position limits too, frankly, is to make sure that there's no undue concentration by one market participant or in any one particular product. So it's critically important for us to have that information to protect against excessive speculation.
Thank you. Commissioner Giancarlo, you mentioned that it is important to have timely data. What is the, if it's out of date, I mean, how harmfully do you think this is in the process? I mean, I can think of out of date data being used in other important aspects, like, whether it's military or space travel, things like that, and it could be very important in this area. What's the effect, do you think?
Thank you, Congressman. 3 weeks ago, we held a meeting of our Energy Environmental Markets Advisory Committee at the CFTC, and our keynote speaker was Adam Szyminski, the administrator of the U.S. Energy Information Administration, a federal government agency. He, on behalf of the federal government, studies movements in energy prices. And he said he sees absolutely no evidence of excessive speculation in the recent fall in energy prices. And yet, the CFTC is using more than 20-year-old data for its estimates of deliverable supply for liquid natural gas.
I need to yield my time, sir. I'd like to follow up with you on that. 20-year-old data, you say?
20-year-old data.
Thank you. We'll come back to you.
Ms. Kirkpatrick.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Mr. Ranking Member, and the Commissioners, thank you very much for being here today. I really appreciate your comments on enforcement because I think that rules and regulations really don't work unless there is adequate enforcement. And I'll be honest with you, I opposed Dodd-Frank for that very reason because I didn't think we were adequately enforcing the rules and regulations we had in place at the time. But there is a Rule 1.35 that requires records of communications be adequately kept. Excuse me, in last year's bill, we removed that record-keeping requirement. We know there's been a recent complaint alleging manipulation of the wheat market by a commercial end user. And, you know, in enforcement, we're always trying to balance the requirements and the extra burden on the end user, and then also the evidence that needs to be preserved for prosecution. My question is, as a former prosecutor, do we need to revisit Section 353? And if that section goes into law, and would it be more difficult for enforcement of these types of cases? So that's for the whole panel. I'd like to know each one of your thoughts on that.
Congresswoman, appreciate the question.
Your microphone sounds like my voice.
So you refer to the section of the bill which would change Rule 1.35 under our rules as it exists today. And we proposed a revision to 1.35 last fall. And so we are in the process of deliberating internally about how to finalize that rulemaking. So there's some limits on what I can say, but here's how I'm looking at this issue. There are two key points, I think, for me. The first is, if you're an entity that has not triggered registration because you're not engaged in the sort of activities that would require that, or if you've consciously chosen to change your activities in a way so that you don't have to register with the CFTC and you're an end user, that's meaningful to me. The second thing that I'm looking at very carefully is, regardless of how we finalize this rule, it should not be done in a way that unnecessarily or unintentionally impedes access by an end user to a particular marketplace. And so those are the two things that are animating my thinking as I'm engaged in these deliberations. I think it's really, really important to point out, Congresswoman, that Rule 1.35 is only one record-keeping obligation under CFTC rules. We have multiple record-keeping obligations under our rules. If you are a member of a futures exchange or a CEF, you have record-keeping obligations, and there are others as well. So, frankly, I think there's been perhaps more attention paid to 1.35 than is merited in a lot of respects. I understand the concerns that people have in complying with it, but I think it's very, very important for us to understand that regardless of the revision to 1.35, there are other record-keeping obligations that enable the enforcement division of our agency to perform its mission.
Other commissioners?
I'll be brief. Congresswoman, thank you for the question. I think I couldn't express it better than Commissioner Weejan just did. There are a lot of balancing factors that go into this, and I agree with all of those factors. I would just also add, as a general goal, the new regulatory framework we've put together, with its shortcomings, which I mentioned, is nevertheless one we want to work. We don't want to discourage membership in swap execution facilities or on registered exchanges. And the impact of 1.35 has been for a number of participants to say, well, then I just won't go involved as a direct member. I'll work through an intermediary. What we want to do is bring more of them onto the platforms, not off. And the final thing I'll say is we have seen a diminution in the number of futures commission merchants of dramatic extent over the last several years. We're down to less than what we had, less than 10 years ago. And this is another rule that FCMs are concerned about in terms of adding to their costs, adding to their burdens, and not adding to their ability to survive in the marketplace. So those are two more factors to add into the balancing here.
Ms. Bowen?
Yes, I think one of the reasons we have devoted so much time to this rule is because we are trying to seek the right balance. You're right, we need to make sure that enforcement has the capability to look back. And that's critically important to us. At the same time, we want to make sure that we don't have unintended consequences of making the rules so onerous that people either flee or that we have shrinkage in our market. So I think we're doing a fairly good job in terms of making the correct balance. I think we will be out hopefully quite soon on a decision on that.
Thank you. My time's expired. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your indulgence. I yield back.
Mr. Davis.
Thank you, Chairman Scott, and thank you to each of the witnesses for being here today. Commissioner Giancarlo, how is the swaps market different than the futures market, and how should those differences be taken into consideration when drafting rules and regulations for the swaps market?
Thank you for the question. The best way I can describe it is the swaps market is as different from the futures market as the bond market is as different from the stock market. The liquidity characteristics, the way in which instruments trade are very, very different. If a share of Microsoft trades in enormous continuous volume from the moment the stock exchange opens in the morning to the moment it closes, millions, if not tens of millions of trades per minute. The bond market, on the other hand, trades with much more episodic trading. A bond, Ford Motor Company's Series G 2028 Q5 bond may trade once a month, and I just made that up. I don't even know if there is such a bond. But it may trade once a month. It trades by appointment. Similarly, the swaps market, for the most part, once you get out of the very center of it, trades by appointment. And therefore, trying to use futures instruments trade just like the stock market, trade highly liquid, constant liquidity. Trying to use futures models to trade swaps products just won't work. And I think one of the biggest shortcomings in our swaps execution transaction protocol is that we assume futures models, continuous order book, electronic models would work in swaps, and they're just not working in swaps.
Well, in your testimony, you suggested ways that we here in Congress could help improve the SEF regime. Can you elaborate on those points and which of these issues may keep you up at night?
Two very different questions. So in terms of where I think help can be, it would be in the core principles that I outlined directly in my testimony. But I'll tell you what keeps me up at night. What keeps me up at night is that I think that we are in our rule writing, we are writing rules to prevent the last crisis, and we are creating the opportunity for a very different crisis. The last crisis was one of counterparty credit risk, and we're doing everything to strengthen bank balance sheets and to cause more capital to be put aside. But the next crisis, as they always are, will be a very different crisis, and I worry the next crisis will be a crisis of market liquidity, that there just won't be availability of the trading instruments that institutions will need to survive a crisis in the marketplace. And if you look at the same rules we're doing now, whether they be the Volcker rule, the Basel capital rule, supplemental leverage ratios, position limits, proposals for transaction taxes, swap trading rules, all of these things are making liquidity, that means the ability to find the other side of a trade, much, much harder. And as we move things into central counterparty clearers, into clearinghouses, I'm worried in the event of another crisis, those clearinghouses won't be able to sell instruments in order to gain the liquidity they need. So I worry, what keeps me up at night is that we're preparing for the last crisis and doing things that are actually going to perhaps, if not cause, exacerbate the next crisis, a crisis of liquidity.
Thank you very much for your response. Commissioners Bowen and Wetchen, have you reviewed the Commissioner's white paper? And if so, do you believe that any of the other recommendations are worth considering?
Congressman, I have reviewed the white paper, and as always, a very thoughtful piece of work by Commissioner Giancarlo, who's been such a great addition to the Commission. The Commissioner is right that swaps do trade differently, but CEFs are different platforms than futures exchanges. There is tremendous flexibility in a CEF. It's not as flexible as a completely unregulated trading venue, which is what we saw before Dodd-Frank was passed, but there's enormous flexibility. Let me give you an example. Under the CEF rule, brokers can broker a trade, just as they did back in 2008, so long as it's then sent to the CEF platform just to see if there's a better price. And there's certain other limits, but But the point is that by and large, that mode of execution under the CEF today, permitted under the CEF today, is very, very similar to how it's been done for a long, long time. The Commissioner is right. We have requirements that there be the offering of an order book, but there's no mandate that anyone trade on the order book. The rule does not say you must trade on the order book. It does not. And order books don't work when there are instruments that don't have a lot of liquidity, as suggested. It also requires an RFQ that says that you have to send the request for a quote out to a minimum of 3 people. We fussed around on the right number of people that the quote, or the request rather, should be sent to. We settled on 3. There's no particular magic in that number either, but the point is that, yes, if you're a CEF, you have to offer an order book, but no one has to trade there. In fact, we've seen CEFs that have order books with very limited trading in the order book. We say, yes, you have to offer an RFQ, but importantly, we offer, the CEF rule allows brokerage of trades so long as they're crossed. So that offers a number of different ways for execution, flexible ways for execution, particularly in the case of a cross, and even an RFQ to some degree. The other thing, though, as I mentioned in my testimony, the preamble of our rule says we need to remain open to and will consider other modes of execution. And one of the things I think we at the agency need to do a better job on is analyzing those other methods of execution expeditiously, getting answers back to the CEFs, giving them some sense of whether they can be allowed or not. And in the analysis about whether they should be allowed, again, has to reflect these 2 mandates under the statute, promoting trading on CEFs, but also promoting pre-trade price transparency.
Thank you. My time.
All right, Mr. Emmer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and the Commissioners for being here. Commissioner Giancarlo, we are concerned about the impact of CFTC Advisory 13-69 on cross-border swap activities. It's our understanding that this advisory triggers CFTC swap rules to be applied to transactions between 2 non-U.S. entities simply because a person located in the U.S. was used to arrange, negotiate, or execute the transaction. Can you clarify for the committee what it means to arrange, negotiate, or execute a transaction and how such activities can import risk back to the United States?
Thank you for that question. I think a lot of the industry is trying to understand what those 3 words mean and what impact they have on their business operations. But the context for this is that these swap execution rules, which I've criticized in my white paper, are meant to apply under an interpretive guidance that was issued by the Commission without cost-benefit analysis in the summer of 2013, are meant to apply to transactions between effectively non-U.S. persons. The staff advisory, the staff guidance that you referenced says that they also apply even if the transaction is between non-U.S. persons. All transaction rules apply if, as you say, a person in the U.S. arranged, negotiated, or executed the transaction. Now, I will tell you that staff advisory has now been delayed 4 times, so it's not in effect, which the fact that it needs to be delayed 4 times tells you a little something about perhaps the efficacy of that staff advisory. But what, to many people, and myself included, it appears to say that if a transaction is taking place outside the United States entirely between non-U.S. persons, if somebody in the U.S. helped in that trade, and I'll give you an example. Let's say you've got a Swiss pension fund looking to buy a credit default protection against the failure of a U.S. company, say Ford Motor Company, but they're trading with a German bank. It's entirely 2 European persons. If one of those banks calls a sales associate in New York who may be the bank's specialist in Ford Motor Company credit, just to say, how's Ford looking these days? What are the ratings on Ford's bonds? Are we comfortable advising this client in Switzerland to buy this bond from us in Germany? Suddenly now this trade, for at least under the advisory, is a U.S. trade and has to be done pursuant to all of our trade execution rules. What that really means is nobody's going to turn to that specialist in New York or Boston or Chicago or Charlotte anymore, and that person's got to worry about whether they're going to have a job next year.
Commissioner Bowen, does the location of the individual negotiating a trade have a direct and significant impact on U.S. commerce if the trade occurs between foreign counterparties in a foreign jurisdiction? Is that a reasonable approach to cross-border regulation, do you think?
It is one approach, but I think...
I was asking if it's a reasonable approach.
I think it's an approach, but I would suggest that we should follow where the risks actually lie. And so whether the person is located in New York versus London in some respects may not be indicative as to where the real risk is. And so we have global markets. The concept of U.S. person, frankly, may be irrelevant because transactions will be taking place in cyberspace. So from my perspective, I think one of the reasons we have opened this up to comment is to look at all the different scenarios. And so that is one approach, but I think there are other approaches.
Thank you. Commissioner Giancarlo, in the short time I have left, there's concern about the CFTC's position limits rule and the new requirement that all bona fide hedge exemptions be evaluated by the Commission rather than by the exchange, as has typically happened with non-enumerated contracts. Inserting the Commission formally into this process of granting exemptions seems like a substantial commitment of new resources. Do you know how much new data the Commission will have to evaluate for this process and how many man-hours this will require of the Commission staff?
Thank you for the question. It is one of my concerns, and as we've talked about earlier about funding of the agency, this is an area where I think the agency is taking on things that could be well done by others. So it's been traditional in the futures industry for the exchanges to operate a system of position accountability. Under our CFTC current proposal, they would not be involved in the process. Everything would be done at the CFTC level through a series of hard limits on positions, not only in the spot month, but in the outer month. The CFTC has also narrowed the bona fide hedge exemptions from a much more longer list that was present before to a much narrower list with no unenumerated hedges. Specifically, the CFTC is not going to recognize storage transactions as bona fide hedges, merchandising and anticipatory hedges, cross-commodity hedges, and cross versus net hedging. These are all tools that have been used for a long, long time in the futures market that under the CFTC's current proposal would not be bona fide hedges. That is not in the interest of many end users of futures and swaps markets in the marketplace.
Thank you. My time's expired.
Chairman Lucas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate this hearing subject matter and our commissioners being here today. Very important. Commissioner Bowen, I understand that you also have shared your concerns about regulatory clarity and how important that is. Let's visit for a moment in regard to cross-border guidance. As you know, the Commission staff issued a series of no action letters, suspending the impact of an unexpected staff advisory letter, which significantly modified the meaning of a footnote, which was buried on the bottom of page 60 of an 80-page of that cross-border guidance. Let me think about this a minute. A series of no action letters designed to suspend an unexpected staff advisory letter, which pertained to a footnote, which was on the bottom of page 60 of an 80-page guidance. In a recent speech, you outlined 3 ways in which regulators can be unclear, and it seems that this particular example might hit the trifecta. After all, there was no notice of the proposed interpretation. The requirements of the interpretation have continually been delayed, and a significant change hinges entirely on a staff interpretation of a Commission guidance document. That's really pretty amazing, actually. Are you concerned, Commissioner, about how the Commission's cross-border guidance has been implemented?
That footnote has gotten a lot of attention, that's for sure. But let me say this, where possible, obviously, rulemaking, what the benefit of notice and comment period is the way to really regulate. But at the same time, we have tools that we can use as well. Guidance and interpretations are one of them. And frankly, when we issue those, they're typically in response to a market participant seeking relief, or asking the question, does this apply to me or not? And so it's a tool to allow us to be a lot more flexible, to respond much more quickly. So the process itself, I support that we use all the tools that we can to be effective and to be responsive.
But you can
I can't
understand,
comment on that particular footnote. I wasn't there at the time.
but you can understand the general principle of a series of no action letters sent out to suspend the impact of a unexpected staff advisory letter, which pertained to the meaning of a footnote on page 60 of the 80-page document. You can understand why that might be a little confusing to both those of us looking over your shoulder and those trying to understand what you're doing. So I guess my question becomes this, and I'll address this first to you and then the whole commission. What are we doing to try to not continue in this pattern of doing things this way? How do we get away from this system? And what are we doing? Start with you, Commissioner Bowen, and then, of course, your colleagues, if they'd care to comment.
Sure. As I said before, the best of our rules, my preference obviously is to do rulemaking through comment and notice. That is our preference. At the same time, I would not want to take away the tool of having staff issue guidance or interpretive releases, because they are responsive to questions that are being asked by the industry. So I would not take those tools away. I think they're extremely important. I think they can be used really effectively. I understand your frustration in terms of that footnote being buried, and we've heard a lot about that footnote.
Because it almost implies that the process with which that set off this chain reaction, there's something wrong with that, or we wouldn't have had to have had this layering effect. Gentlemen, any comments, thoughts?
Congressman, I think you put your finger on it. The problem with the abuse of the no action letter process is it erodes the public's confidence in the agency's undertaking of its responsibilities. And secondly, it thwarts our ability, it stymies our ability as an agency to inculcate a compliance culture in the companies that we oversee. It really hurts our own reputation, and it makes it harder for us to do our job in terms of the companies we regulate.
Commissioner. Commissioner Lucas, it's a great question. I think one of the ways to avoid the need for unnecessary or plentiful no action letters is to be sure there's maximum consensus in the policy making in the first instance. That tends to be a good barometer and a good way of predicting what kinds of challenges, unexpected or otherwise, you might face and market participants might face. And usually that means that if there's full consensus, it usually means that there's been a nice fulsome taking into account of the comment file. So that's one way to do it. But if I can just add one other thing, Congressman, I think we need to look at this in its proper context. We at the CFTC were given an enormous task to do. We had to pass more than 50+ rules to implement Title VII. So it's inevitable that in a process like that, there are going to be unexpected compliance challenges. And I think we've been as responsible as we could be in responding to those, and this no action relief is an important tool to use in that regard. If the chairman will indulge me for just a moment, I wholeheartedly agree, Commissioner. The magnitude and the scope of what was dumped in the lap of the commission was far beyond what it should have been, set up in a fashion that was far more complicated, far more convoluted, and the process with which some of your predecessors interpreted it only made it more complicated from my perspective. But that said, we cannot allow this way of doing business to become the new norm. We cannot allow this to be the standard way that we do things at the Commission. The confusion that it will bring amongst the participants, the confusion it brings in the market is just unacceptable. So that's my simple point to you. This cannot become the new norm, and I worry that that's where we're headed. With that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Lucas. We're going to get our second round of questions now. I'm going to let Mr. Scott go ahead of me.
Thank you. I'd like to get into the cross-border issues here, because I have a concern that we need to be very careful as we deal with our foreign markets, our foreign competitors, that we not put our financial system, our financial industry, as both our market participants and our end users, in a non-competitive position. Issues like, for example, the push-out rule, which to me, to push out commodity swaps, for example, from the same bank in which you're doing the interest rate swaps, clearly puts our end users as well as our banking system at a disadvantage. And my whole point that I want to ask on that is, how are these other foreign markets doing? Are they doing the same thing? The other point I want to ask is, how do you all measure, and I think in collaboration with the Securities and Exchange Commission, what accounts for a robust regime that has the same measure and depth of regulation that we have when we go in and we're going to allow that to happen? So on position limits, on the clearinghouse risk, on these issues, I know, Mr. Wishon, you've put a lot of time into cross-borders. If you could give us a little clarity on that, and you as well, Mr. Gallo, and Ms. Bowen, if you'd like to comment on that, particularly on the push-out deal, I'd be appreciative. Yes, sir.
Ranking Member Scott, thank you for the question. You had asked what other markets are doing on the cross-border front, which I understood to mean where are they with respect to the reform effort. Back in 2009, the G20 convened in Pittsburgh and agreed to a series of reforms as it relates to derivatives. And there are several key points: increased transparency through reporting, clearing of liquid swaps, and then, where appropriate, trading of swaps on regulated venues. So all the G20 nations agree to that. They're in different states of the implementation stage as you look around the globe. Europe has done a great deal. They're beginning to impose clearing mandates. I don't think we're likely to see a trading mandate anytime soon. Japan has a clearing mandate in place. They're expected to have a trading mandate in place later this year. So there's significant progress in those two jurisdictions, but as we've discussed earlier, there's still a lag time between when our rules went into effect and when theirs are going into effect. And to be fair, there's some differences as well. So those are all going to have to be managed. That's why I say in my testimony that I think the appropriate thing to do is be sure that during this stage, as the rest of the G20 nations complete their process, we make sure our institutions in the U.S. are competitive. And back to the guidance, we took care to try and be sure that that's the case. And then once the rest of the nations have completed their task, we can look again and see how everything compares, how the global marketplace fabric is fitting together, and decide whether additional policy makings might take place.
So do any of you see where we're putting our American end users, our American financial institutions in any phase of all of the issues of cross-border in a disadvantaged position with what is going on now? Is there any area we need to really worry about where we're putting our financial institutions or end users? These folks operate all around the world, and I want to see if we're putting them at any risk. Mr. Giancarlo, you mentioned a little bit about that when you talked about the energy, the manufacturers, the farmers. I'm very concerned about that. I got a lot of farmers in Georgia and manufacturers like Coca-Cola. I mean, we don't want to put them at...
Can I take a moment and walk you through a somewhat complex issue, but I think it does answer your specific question. So clearly one of the premise of Dodd-Frank was that we would find a way to ring fence the American markets from imported risk from abroad. But one of our rules, I think, might have the effect of actually retaining risk within that ring fence environment and disable end users, farmers, manufacturers' ability to hedge risk outside of the United States. And that is in the matter of internal risk transfer. The charging of an initial margin when an intermediary between an end user and an overseas marketplace for a swap that may reduce their risk, when that intermediary, whether it's a bank or other financial house, has to charge initial margin on their own transaction between their U.S. affiliate and their overseas company. Now, I'll give you an example that I think will clarify this. Let's say that John Deere, a tractor manufacturer that employs a lot of workers to build tractors, also has a plant in, let's say, Japan, where they make steering wheels, for example, and they borrow in the Japanese currency to build and operate that plant. And yet their cost of borrowing is in US dollars. They have risk of the Japanese interest rate changing, and that's real risk in this market. They may seek to hedge that risk in the Japanese marketplace and use a Japanese financial house. But if that Japanese financial house has to charge internal margin, the cost has now just gone up to John Deere, who may have a factory in Ohio, for example. And what that means is they won't hedge that Japanese yen interest rate risk in Japan, they'll hedge it in the United States. That's risk that we're warehousing here and not taking abroad. So when we talk about ring fencing our markets from risk, as Commissioner Bowen rightly puts it, these are global marketplaces. If you ring fence from outside risk, you're also keeping internal risk in our own marketplace, and that's something we have to take account of.
Yeah, very well stated. Thank you, sir.
Mr. LaMalfa.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate allowing me to go ahead here again with other subcommittees pending right now, too. Following back with Mr. Giancarlo, you were speaking earlier about timeliness and current up-to-date data, and you were talking about in energy, is this it's a negative effects, 20-year-old data, was this affecting swaps or swap dealers, or please elaborate.
Thank you for the question. So one of the parts of our position limits rules is that the CFTC will determine what the appropriate limits are based upon what's called deliverable supply estimates. What is the available supply of an instrument by which one may hedge in? It's very important to have up-to-date data. My understanding is the data we're using for position limits in gold and silver is 30 years old. It goes back to the 1980s. The data we're using for liquid natural gas is based on 1990s data. Now, everyone knows that we've had a complete revolution in the production of natural gas in the United States in the last 6 or 7 years.
There's been some changes, yeah.
There's been dramatic changes, and yet we're still using 20-year-old data to determine deliverable supply.
Why is it? Why are we stuck in that?
I don't know the answer.
How do we fix it?
Well, certainly I at the Commission are calling for the use of contemporary data to set these deliverable supply estimates. I don't know how, in a modern economy, as a world-class regulator that we strive to be, that we could be using out-of-date data to set deliverable supply estimates.
We look forward to working with you on how to accomplish that.
I'd be delighted to keep you apprised of how that comes along.
Thank you. In my remaining time, Commissioner Bowen, switching gears here a little bit, the proposed bona fide hedge rules ignore existing commercial market practices of allowing a market participant to obtain a hedge exemption in the spot month for unfixed price purchases and sales. Unfixed contracts are a legitimate hedging tool for sellers, yet these will no longer be allowed under the rules. Why is the Commission seeking to take away this long-standing legitimate hedging tool from farmers? Does this change to long-standing exemptions meet your definition of regulatory clarity that was discussed earlier? So again, why is the Commission looking to take away this long-standing hedging tool from farmers?
Right, as you know, that's a subject that we have looked at, we're continuing to look at, but as you know, it is important that farmers can use hedging to hedge against legitimate commercial risk. That's critically important, and so we don't intend to put obstacles in the way to prevent effective market risk-taking activity. That's really not the point. I don't believe that we are managing the process and receiving comments that would suggest that we would create new obstacles. That's not what we're doing. We're trying to be practical.
Again, the proposed rule.
It's a proposed rule, yes.
Yes, well, then the proposed rule hanging out there is a concern for people that it would be implemented and taken away that existing ability to use these practices. So how do we put this proposed rule in the back burner then?
Yeah, what we've done with the proposed rule is we've opened up for comments. We're reviewing the comments that we receive from the industry, and we're making sure that...
How are the comments looking? Pardon my interruption. How are the comments?
They're very comprehensive. We've received hundreds of comments from many end users.
Are the percentages running heavily one way or the other on the...
I can't comment on that specifically, but I'm happy to meet with you later on that.
All right, please, if you could submit a statement to my office or my staff on that, on how that looks, because it'd be, I would imagine, be pretty overwhelming, given the feeling, the feedback we're getting so far on this, that they're not at all in favor of the proposed rule, and that it should likely be scrapped, or some other angle taken on that. The follow-up question on that, does this change to longstanding exemptions meet your definition of regulatory clarity that was discussed earlier on? Regulatory clarity, is this meet that goal? Do we need that?
Well, again, I think that the point in having and receiving comments from the industry is to make sure we take into account all viewpoints. And the way to...
What you're looking for, one of the things you defined earlier is looking for regulatory clarity.
Correct.
Does the industry feel like it has enough clarity already, or is this something that's entirely being
I think the industry is seeking more clarity, sir. I really do. I think the industry would like for us to give them more clarity, and that's our job as regulators.
I run into that again and again when people have long-standing practices they're pretty comfortable with, and then the federal government comes up with additional clarity that actually harms those folks. So we're talking farming and ranching practices in regards to water, environment, whatever. Clarity has generally closed doors to them, and that's what I think I'm hearing here. So please be apprised of how people are feeling about when clarity gives them less options, okay? And we look forward to previous information on how those comments are going. If you could submit that to my office committee with the chairman's permission. Thank you.
Ms. Kirkpatrick.
Commissioner Giancarlo, I really appreciate your comment that we may be too focused on the past financial crisis and not enough on the future, which you identify as a crisis in market liquidity. And Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Scott, I hope you would consider maybe having a hearing of this committee specifically on that issue. But Commissioner, very briefly, could you just give us a framework for what you see as that crisis, where that happens, and maybe some just a framework of how we could put into place some safeguards to maybe prevent that?
It's very hard to have a crystal ball as to what it might look like.
I appreciate that, but I think it's something we should talk about.
But what I start from is I look at the measures that we're putting in place now, and I say, is there a sort of a net impact of these measures? And if you look at so many of the measures, they are all banking-driven measures. They're all measures to strengthen the balance sheets of institutions. And in strengthening balance sheets, which is a worthy goal, there's no question about it, what that does is those institutions are not putting that capital to work, it's sitting on their balance sheet. So that capital is not in the marketplace to make markets, to transacted markets. It's not available to end users and other market participants to put that capital to work. So let's look at some of the rules we put in place. The Volcker Rule, the Basel capital requirements, the supplementary leverage ratios. These are all capital constraining provisions. And then add on top of it our own proposed position limits rule, which in certain parts of the marketplace will perhaps take out participants who would normally be there providing liquidity. And then there's talk from time to time about different swaps trading or trading taxes or transaction taxes, which would be another, whatever the merits of that proposal would have another liquidity reducing impact on the marketplace.
And then there's additional margin on uncleared swaps. So all of these initiatives all have important purposes and constituents and momentum behind them, but every one of them has a liquidity reduction impact to it. And I don't know what provisions are going in place that have liquidity enhancing elements to it. So I do worry that the net impact of important rulemaking, though, will be to take liquidity out of the market. When a crisis comes, that's when everyone pulls back. And I'm worried that in the face of all these requirements to warehouse capital on bank balance sheets, they will pull back in the event of crisis. And last point on this, I was in the markets in 2008 during the financial crisis. It was not a crisis of liquidity. Even the swaps market was liquid throughout the financial crisis. Banks were in the market, buying and selling, making liquid markets for market participants. I wonder if in the next crisis they will remain in that same posture, or whether they'll pull back from the marketplace.
I really appreciate that. That was exactly my concern at the time, that we would overreact in a way that would hurt us in the future. And any other commissioners want to address that?
Commissioner, it's a great question, and something I've given some thought to as well. As Commissioner Giancarlo says, in large result because of prudential requirements on traditional banking institutions, we've seen some of the retreat from liquidity provision by those same institutions, whether that's in the derivatives markets or other markets as well, including the bond markets. So to me, one of the solutions I think has to be, how do we open up these marketplaces to additional different types of, or non-traditional liquidity providers? As Commissioner Giancarlo has discussed, there are risks that come along with that as well, because in a lot of cases, these non-traditional firms have practices or execution strategies or what have you that they're electronic, automated, and so consequently carry with them different types of risks that also have to be managed. We do have a series of risk controls in place for our exchanges and for our intermediaries to try and address that. We're looking at other measures that we might impose on these types of firms, so risk controls that will apply to the trading firms themselves. But to me, that's something as policymakers we need to be open to, because there seems to be a lot of consensus behind some of these additional prudential requirements on traditional banks who are important liquidity providers. So part of the solution, it just seems as a matter of logic, has to be, okay, well, how do we bring in other liquidity providers, non-bank liquidity providers, and what kinds of risks do they pose that are different from the traditional ones, and how do we manage those risks?
And thank you. My time's expired, but I do hope that this is something the committee will look at. Thank you. I yield back.
Yes, ma'am, and I'd like to point out on that same issue, Chairman Conaway and Ranking Member Peterson have both sent a letter to the prudential regulators expressing some of the same concerns, and I think that that's something that the leadership of the committee and both Democrat and Republicans have, and I think we'll be spending a lot of time on that particular issue and making sure that we get it right. Commissioner Bowen, this is pretty much for you, but I'll ask the others to follow up as well. Released a Financial Times article on Sunday that indicated that according to data from the CFTC, the number of registered futures commission merchants is down significantly to 71 at the end of February, which is down from 91 a year earlier and 189 in 2005. It's my understanding that you're the sponsor of the Market Risk Advisory Committee, and my concern is that the drastic reduction in the number of clearing members could lead to additional risk, some systemic risk, and I'd just like for you to speak to that issue, if you would.
Yes, thank you for that question, and that is an issue that we are looking at. We are concerned whenever there's concentration that reduces the number of platforms and places where end users can go. So that's something we will definitely take a look at. I will say, though, I do think the current interest rate environment probably contributes somewhat to the reduction, but we'll take a look at other sources as well. But On your question about concentration risk as well, our INRAC committee is looking at clearinghouses and its impact and its default management regimes, again, as a way to address any concerns as to whether we're creating more risk. And so I look forward to looking at both of those issues more in depth.
Would each of you speak to that as well, the loss of members?
Chairman, that's an issue that I mentioned in my written testimony, the concerns around FCM concentration. I think Commissioner Bone is right. A lot of the reason why we've seen some institutions getting out of the clearing brokerage business is because of the low interest rate environment. There are limits on what kinds of investments can be made with customer monies that are held in or taken in by the members, and so again with the low interest environment, you just aren't getting the same kinds of returns as you used to see before, and so that explains to some degree what we've seen in terms of the retreat by some of these FCMs. The other reason is as we discussed before, some of the additional prudential requirements on these same institutions have made the business more difficult. So we have to be mindful of that. As you alluded to, if we have too few number clear members in FCMs, it's going to lead to problems with respect to accessibility to the marketplace, particularly by the end user community.
2 points. Briefly, Mr. Chairman, of that number of 74 or so FCMs, there's probably closer to 50 that are actually serving farmers, ranchers, and manufacturers. We're also seeing a concentration of futures commission merchants with major dealer banks and less smaller FCMs, which are the traditional service providers to smaller end users. So this is a real concern. My fellow commissioners are absolutely right that the low interest rate environment hurts their business model, but we need to be very careful with the regulations that we're piling on them, that the costs of complying with regulations is also not difficult for them. And I just want to add one other thing. Commissioner Bowen held an excellent meeting of her sponsored committee, the Market Risk Advisory Committee, a few weeks ago, in which we heard from some of these non-traditional liquidity providers that Commissioner Weegen mentioned. And I think that's a real opportunity. These advisory committees operated by at the CFTC are one of the unique aspects of our agency, and I think they provide very valuable input to a lot of the questions that we've been discussing today. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for allowing us a second round of questions. Sometimes a 5-minute limit, is not as accommodating as the 5 times limit that you guys deal with. Commissioner Giancarlo, the Commission recently offered no action relief for Southwest Airlines for its hedges in illiquid markets, and some have questioned the Commission's rationale for not broadening that relief to any similarly situated market participant, and in effect requiring a hedger to come to the CFTC and plead the same case over and over again. Would you support offering broad relief to any market participant who is similarly situated in illiquid swaps markets?
Yes, I would. I found that matter to be quite interesting because it actually illustrates the point I made earlier in response to your question about how the swaps market is different than the futures market. As I mentioned, liquidity in the swaps market is very different. There are a number of very important market participants, such as Southwest Airlines, that are engaged in transactions that just can't settle in a day, 2 days, 3 days. They may take longer, and our rules need to be much more open to that. It should not be an exception to our rule that there's transactions like that. Our rule framework should accommodate transactions like that. And market participants shouldn't have to come cap in hand to the CFTC with a question that says, "Mother, may I?" to engage in a transaction that is just part of their everyday business of serving their customers. Our rule framework should allow for that because that is the nature of the swaps market. It's very different than futures. It's the nature of the swaps market.
Thank you. Commissioner Bowen, do you agree?
I think this is one instance, in fact, where you see the staff being really responsive to a request for relief and no action, which is why it's critically important that we don't do away with those tools. To the extent that there may be other participants, they're in the same situation, they should come forward and seek relief.
So on an individualized basis?
Oh, I think that case is frankly quite unique. And I think part of it had to do with whether or not the disclosure of their hedging strategies, whether that itself would change the pricing for them.
Okay.
So I think it was quite unique.
No other airlines have come and said, we want to see this happen?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay. Commissioner Wudgeon?
I do think that I believe we're referring to the relief on the real-time reporting obligation and there was relief given to Southwest Air. Yeah. I think we should try and deal with issues like that on more of a broad basis than an individualized basis. And if there is in fact an unintended effect on liquidity based on reporting, it does stand to reason that it could be impactful for other market participants as well. So it does make you wonder, well, does something need to be addressed in the timing of the reporting of those particular long-dated swaps? So I think that is something we should revisit.
Great.
Incidentally, Commissioner, I expect we'll probably get requests, and you might have that on your mind when you ask that question, but I wouldn't be surprised if we get requests from others.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you for your response. Commissioner Giancarlo, Mr. Ranking Member Scott asked a question on requiring margin, and I'd like to ask a follow-up to that. And on internal risk management swaps, does requiring the margin on internal risk transfer trades improve the systemic safety of our markets?
I know that's been argued, but I don't honestly appreciate how it does. The answer is I don't see how that does improve systemic safety. I think, in fact, if anything, it probably adds to systemic risk because it causes risk to be kept within the within the United States as opposed to allowing hedgers to hedge risk in markets outside the United States where they may find greater liquidity. So in the example I gave of John Deere, if they have to pay more because their agent they're using in that instance to hedge outside the United States has to charge internal margin because of CFTC rules, then that added cost will just have that domestic end user, John Deere in my example, say, you know what, it's too expensive to hedge outside, we'll hedge inside. So the risk is remaining here, not being exported outward.
Great. Thank you. My time's expired.
Mr. Emmer.
Thank you, Chairman Scott. Commissioner Wudgeon, although the reporting rules were the first set of rules to be finalized, much has been made of the Commission's difficulty consolidating and analyzing trade data. Last summer, the Commission solicited comment on potential improvements to the reporting rules. Can we assume that many of the comments identified both problems and solutions, suggested solutions, and what does the Commission plan to do with the information received through this process, and when will a plan be implemented?
Thank you, Congressman. There is going to be action. There should be action. And I think the first matter we're going to address is what to do about trades that begin bilaterally but then become cleared, and what are the different reporting obligations for the bilateral parties in the first instance, and then for the clearinghouse once it becomes cleared. So there's been some work on that. There's been confusion under the existing rules because a lot of times it appears from the data that the original swap that ultimately was cleared is still outstanding. And once it's cleared, it becomes novated, and so that's no longer the case. So that has the effect of bringing inaccuracies to the data set, so we need to address that.
Can you answer my question, though, about when will a plan be implemented?
Well, that's just one particular rule that I think will come from the solicitation of comments. When that happens, the rulemaking identified when that happens, I'm not sure. I've been briefed by the staff at the agency about it, but we have not seen an actual recommendation. We've seen nothing in writing. My understanding is that we should see something relatively soon, but I can't say for sure.
Relatively soon, is that like this month or next month or?
I don't know the answer to that.
All right,
sir.
Thank you. Commissioner Giancarlo, in your opinion, does the CFTC currently have the necessary technology to monitor the massive amounts of new swaps data that flow into the Commission on a daily basis? And what is the ultimate goal of the Commission with respect to collecting this type of data?
You know, the situation we find ourselves in is something that out in Silicon Valley and other places where they use enormous amounts of data, and firms like Google and Facebook and others, they call that big data, the emerging science of how to analyze enormous amounts of data. Well, as a government agency, we find ourselves with a big data problem as well, but without all of those terrific tools and talents and training that they have out in Silicon Valley. It's something we're going to have to move much further in. Dodd-Frank has charged us with enormous responsibility in terms of gathering data, analyzing data. It's something that I think should be broadly supported as a mission. As someone who was in the markets during the financial crisis, it was clear that there was not accurate data of which institution had exposure to which institution, and it's part of the reason why the TARP program was as broad as it was, simply because the lack of a real ability to discern the absolute exposures of one institution to another. So I think we do have to master the big data problem, but that's a very, very difficult thing to do. Some of the brightest minds in the world are moving into this new emerging science, and we need to catch up with it.
Commissioner Bowen, that was the extent of my questions, but I saw you start to lean forward, so I wondered if you had a comment on that same question.
No, I was just going to add and echo the need for us to have the capability to be relevant and up to date with the market, and yet again, another reason why we could really use additional funding.
Thank you. I yield back.
Well, thank you. And before we adjourn, I understand that Congressman Scott may have an additional question, and I'd like to recognize him for that, and as the ranking member, allow him to make any closing remarks that he may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thought it would be good for us to ask this question because we're going to have to put together a bill, a new bill for reauthorization of the CFTC. We had a previous bill, 4413. So give us your thoughts on how you feel, any suggestions, recommendations, if you've read over any of this, that you would instruct us as a committee that we can improve upon this work. Any thoughts?
I'm happy to say that for many of the things that are in the bill, we as a commission have already begun to address those. I think to the extent that we really need flexibility as regulators, it's really our job to be able to be responsive to the market. And so I think sometimes it could be complicated to have things codified that may not give us that flexibility. So I would urge that you give us as much flexibility as possible. As I said in my opening statement, if you can find a way to impose additional user fees or ways for us to fund ourselves, that would be greatly appreciated.
Good. All right. Thank you. Yes, Mr. Giancarlo.
If I could, Ranking Member, I'd like to just suggest 5 areas where I think the reauthorization bill could benefit the industry generally and the CFTC's work specifically. We took action with regard to special entity utilities, those small taxpayer-owned utilities. But supporting that in a reauthorization bill, I think, would underline the work we've done at the Commission level. Secondly, I've mentioned improvement in the core principles for swap execution facilities.
Well, you said special
entity utilities.
Entity utility.
Yeah, these are the small taxpayer-owned electric utilities and others.
Okay.
The core principles for swap execution facilities, which I mentioned, I believe that Congress got most of Title VII quite right at the beginning, but the core principles were lifted out of the core principles for futures exchanges, and there's some work that needs to be done there in a few instances, which I've laid out in my written testimony. The swap deal are de minimis. As I said before, I really feel that that level should not be lowered unless we read, interpret, and make a decision based upon the study that we've already authorized to do. And I think congressional support for that would be very helpful. There is a provision in Dodd-Frank with regard to indemnifying overseas regulators if they seek information from our swap data repositories. That has been an irritant between regulatory relations between ourselves and our European counterparts for years now, and I know there's been talk about removing that indemnification language, and I think I would highly encourage the committee to put that in the reauthorization language. It would help us do our mission at the CFTC.
Well, to your knowledge, is there any opposition? Have you heard any opposition to removing that? It makes sense. Is there anybody against that? Did you know about?
I haven't heard of any. I'm not
Okay.
aware of any. I will check with my staff, and if there is, I will make you aware of it.
Okay.
And then finally, the initial margin charged on those internal risk transfers that I discussed a few moments ago with the member, that would be an area where if we seek to really think about systemic risk, that's one area where actually I think the effect of it is to warehouse risk in the United States, not export it. So I would ask that you think about that as well.
Okay, Ms. Wetchen?
I agree with Commissioner Giancarlo. I think the indemnification provision under Dodd-Frank should be eliminated. It's created too many difficulties, and I think it just needs to be changed. I would echo what Commissioner Bowen said about whatever the Congress does. It's important that it leaves with the agency sufficient flexibility to adjust to changing circumstances. And so any authorities, I think, would need to bear that in mind, and that would be helpful and allow us to continue executing our mission.
Thank you. We got it, indemnification, eliminated, flexibility, funding, and the special entity utilities. Now, last question I want to ask, I'm going to go back to you, Ms. Bowen. We got this serious threat now, cybersecurity, and I know you've sunk your teeth into this. How serious a threat is it, and is the threat greater with what, for example, particularly our critical clearinghouses and exchanges, and the third parties that they have to? How far does the threat go, and what are we doing? It's a big territory out here we got to cover because there's so many players, the clearinghouses, exchanges, or the companies. How serious is this threat?
I think it's a serious threat, and I think, we can try to put the best practices and protocols in place, and to, have different levels of protection, if you will, so that those that are most at risk or have the most risky products would have to have measures in place that are specific to them and additional ones. But, again, I think, the weakest link makes us vulnerable. So to the extent that our markets are so interconnected, and to the extent that we often, our participants rely on third-party vendors, there are different ways that someone could, in fact, wreak havoc to our system. So I think it's critically important that we allow our participants to have really robust systems in place, and that we have the ability as a commission
Let me just ask,
to make sure they're doing that.
The chairman's going to put on, specifically, how do you judge the protections against cybersecurity, with the exchanges and the clearinghouses? I think those are very critical. Are there any variations there with clearinghouses or the exchanges?
I think that the types of protections that you want to have in place should be equally as robust.
But do you see, are there any alarm bells that have been
Could have happened so far?
Yeah, to your knowledge.
Not yet.
All right, let me just end by saying, thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's been another very good hearing, and it's a joy working with you. And thank you, commissioners. Appreciate your testimony.
I too would like to thank you all for being here and taking the time to advise us and for the work that you do. And as I've said, I look forward to a bill that balances that access and integrity, and moving that piece of legislation hopefully sooner rather than later. So we'll be working hand in hand with you to get that language correct. And with that, under the rules of the committee, the record of today's hearing will remain open for 10 calendar days to receive additional material and supplementary written responses from the witnesses to any questions posted by a member. The Subcommittee on Commodity Exchanges, Energy, and Credit hearing is now adjourned.
Way to go, Chairman. Good meeting.
Next time you need an hour, you just